Maybe part of lobbying and influence, though, is just being able to have the conversation.
Right.
Like the money gets you the conversation, and the PAC donation gets you to the member of Congress. It doesn't necessarily mean that you win the argument,
Sure.
but you need that access to have the argument.
Welcome to another episode of Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop, co-founder of Social Driver. Let's face it, Washington is the center of influence in the US and arguably in the world. Chief Influencer features leaders who have figured out how to break through in today's fragmented and fast-changing environment. Social Driver teamed up with the Communications Board and the George Washington University College of Professional Studies to recognize these incredible leaders as chief influencers and highlight how they inspire and influence others. I'm thrilled to welcome today's guest, Brody Mullins, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and co-author of The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. I have to say, I loved this book. It's a gripping look at how lobbying evolved into one of the most powerful forces shaping Washington. I hope everyone will read it or listen to it. And I think after you hear Brody today, you'll definitely want to. But before we dive into the interview, here's just a few things I think you should know about today's guest. First, Brody has spent 2 decades exposing how power really works. As an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal's Washington Bureau, he covered the intersection of business lobbying and politics, breaking stories that help put accountability and ethics back on the public agenda. Second, he's pulling back the curtain on the modern influence economy. In his book, The Wolves of K Street, Brody and co-author Luke Mullins trace the rise of corporate power in the lobbying industry, showing how behind-the-scenes operators can shape outcomes that affect everyday life far beyond Capitol Hill. And third, his work has earned the field's highest honors. Brody has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, along with other major journalism recognition for reporting that holds powerful institutions to account. Brody, you've been called many things: a Pulitzer Prize-winning watchdog, a master storyteller of Washington's shadow system, and one of the reporters who helped redefine how Americans understand influence on K Street. Today, we're thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to start with your book. I have to say, I loved it. I mean, it's not always, the case that you read something that you find really informative and that you learn from, but that also is a gripping page turner, really entertaining. I've recommended it to so many people, but for those who haven't read The Wolves of K Street yet, I'd love for them to get a sense of the story that you tell and your approach. So if you had to explain the core thesis in just a couple minutes, what did you and Luke discover about how influence really works in Washington?
Yeah. So thanks for the compliments. I appreciate it. I mean, that's exactly what we're setting off to do. I mean, the book that we're writing about, the book that we wrote, is about the last 50 years of corporate power in America, how companies grew their influence machines and became such a powerful force in politics and government and elections and society, starting in the 1970s. And something fascinating that we found out that we didn't know about was that before the 1970s, companies had very little influence in Washington. So we talk about sort of how they went from not having any influence to being the most powerful political force in DC. But because that, can be sort of a heavy topic, we're talking about political action committees and campaign donations and lobbying and political influence. We decided to tell the story through the lives of 4 or 5 different lobbyists who shaped how lobbying has changed from the 1970s to now. And we begin with a dead body on a golf course. We're writing about a lobbyist named Evan Morris, who was a top lobbyist for Genentech, who sort of epitomized some of the pitfalls of the sort of modern lobbying system and really the greed and potential, for corruption in Washington. So we sort of start with this like dramatic movie-like scene of this dead body on a golf course with a bullet hole in his head. And we basically say, like, how did this guy get here? In order to figure out what happened to this guy and how he got here, we're going to rewind the clock and tell you about how corporate America and lobbying has changed in Washington.
Yeah, and you say that it was surprising to you. It was surprising to me that corporations were not as influential several decades ago. I think many people probably just assumed that that corporate influence had always been there. So
yeah,
to kind of hear just a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, if it surprised you, it really surprised me because I'd covered corporate influence and lobbying in Washington for my whole career and was sort of ignorant of the history. So, if you, like me, remember in college and high school, you remember learning about, after the industrial age, there were these huge tycoons in industry the railroad barons and J.P. Morgan and the big monopolies of Standard Oil and whatnot, and the Rockefellers. And I sort of thought from that period to now, companies have always been, big companies always had lots of influence in Washington. And it turned out that's not true at all. That after we had those big trusts, we called them trusts back then, we had trust busters with the progressive era, and we enacted the antitrust or created the antitrust laws. We created the Federal Trade Commission to regulate big businesses, and all sorts of antitrust laws. And from really the early 1900s to the 1970s, companies had very little influence in Washington. From the New Deal to the Great Society, companies sort of sat back and thought their job was to run their businesses, and the government's job was to run the government, and businesses tried to sort of stay in their lane. And during that time, as we all know, the government grew and grew and grew, and all these new departments and agencies that were created during that time, not just by Democrats, but also by Republicans. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, was created by Richard Nixon and Republicans. Later, or earlier, I should say, President Johnson and the Great Society created, dozens of new agencies. So up into the 1960s and 70s, companies sort of let that happen. And then what changed is in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter was president. We had a recession. We had stagflation. We had inflation. The economy cratered, and businesses for the first time in 100 years said, what's going on? All these rules and regulations in Washington are killing our businesses. What do we do about it? And they decided to, for the first time in 100 years, invest in Washington by starting lobbying offices in Washington, by making campaign donations, by hiring lobbyists, and really trying to push back on the system. And that's sort of where our story begins, is when companies for the first time start gaining influence in Washington. And the 1970s were that pivot point.
So one of the things, obviously, that you cover is the rise of that influence. Another theme or framework that really jumped out at me from the book is this idea of inside influence versus outside influence. And I wonder if you could lay that out a little bit for us. But then I also would like to ask, since your book came out, do you think the framework still holds, or are we entering a new category altogether?
Yeah. So two very good, totally different questions. I'll make sure I get to the second one. So you're exactly right. So one of the things we write about is sort of how companies have maintained their grip on Washington. And they've done that, really by evolving and changing tactics. And that sort of goes to how government and government power has changed in DC. So before the 1970s, government power in DC was held by just a handful of people. The President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, maybe a few committee chairs, all powerful white men who basically created all rules and regulations and laws for the country and for industry, society, civil rights, everything. And Watergate changed that. Watergate was a scandal about the abuse of power in the White House. And a result of that, Congress elected about 90 new members of Congress, reformers to Washington. They were called the Watergate babies. And their job was to reform Washington. They took power from the White House. They moved it to Congress. They took power from Congress and they moved it to committees and subcommittees. And that really changed how Washington worked. Rewind a second, how that affects lobbying. When only a handful of people ran Washington, one lobbyist who knew those handful of people was incredibly successful. So getting back to how we write about characters, during that period, we write about a guy named Tommy Boggs. Tommy Boggs was the most successful lobbyist of the 1960s, 1970s, and even decades later, because he grew up as the son of House Majority Leader Hale Boggs. Hale Boggs was the House Majority Leader from Louisiana. He was one of the few people who held power in DC. And in that era, Hale Boggs was friends with John F. Kennedy and with LBJ and with the Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker. So Boggs grew up literally getting to know JFK and LBJ, worked for LBJ. So Boggs, the son, the lobbyist, knew all these members of Congress, and they were the only people who controlled power. So he was the top lobbyist because he had relationships with a few people who controlled Washington. After Watergate, power is diffuse. Hundreds of members of Congress all of a sudden have influence over legislation, all sorts of new committees and subcommittees. Tommy Boggs used to joke that after Watergate, when he went up to Capitol Hill and yelled out, "Hey, Mr. Chairman," half the people would turn around because almost everyone had a committee or subcommittee. In fact, at one point in the Senate, 99 out of 100 senators were either a committee or subcommittee chairman or ranking member. So everyone's got power. And that means Tommy Boggs can't know everyone. You need teams of lobbyists. So at that point, lobbying changed, and we had so many more lobbyists to get to know all those folks. And then what happened was, sort of because of campaigns and increased media scrutiny on sort of these deals between lobbyists and lawmakers, the lobby industry started moving away from the inside game, which is what we call that, to the outside game. The outside game is basically is based on the idea that a member of Congress will do anything to get reelected. Their number one job is to get reelected. And to get reelected, you obviously need the support of 51% of your constituents. And lobbyists know that. So it used to be that lobbyists would go up to a member of Congress and try to persuade them with an argument or give a campaign donation or take them to a steak dinner and say, hey, vote for me. And that could work for a while, those relationships. But now members of Congress are worried about someone writing a story about that or them being, outed for a deal with a lobbyist. So now lobbyists really try to go to constituents. And the idea is that if you can get 51% of a member of Congress's constituents to support a tariff or a trade bill or a tax cut, the member of Congress is going to follow. So much of lobbying is now shaping public opinion. What does the public think about something? And the idea is that if the public believes in policy X or Y, the members of Congress are going to follow. Now getting to the last best question, which is how has Trump changed everything? So Trump has changed everything. So what he's done is sort of move everything back to where it used to be. So Trump, as we know, has taken all this power from Congress, all power from his own executive branch agencies, and sort of moved all legislation or laws or policy through the White House. So with the exception of the tax bill, instead of moving legislation through Congress, Trump signs executive orders and he skips Congress. So all of a sudden he's moved power in Washington back to that era where only a few people in Washington control power. In fact, it's not just a few, it's just one. It's only Donald Trump, which means all those other lobbyists who used to know and have access to the Ways and Means Committee chair, the Senate Finance Committee chair, that really doesn't matter as much anymore. Now it's all about getting to Trump. And therefore the lobbying industry has gone back to just a handful of people who are close to Trump, which is a really fascinating change because when our book came out, the first 2/3 of my answer was true. And then now everything's gone, back to where it was before. So we're sort of entering back into have entered into a pre-Watergate era, which is completely fascinating. I mean, literally, if we had this conversation a year ago, the government would function differently than it does now. I mean, Donald Trump has just turned everything upside down.
So there's a ton to unpack there.
So much.
I think one thing I want to maybe focus on for a moment is just this shift that if you want to influence public policy, you saw this shift historically from focusing on the decision makers, the members of Congress, whoever, the individual decision makers are. That expanded, more committee members, subcommittee chairs, ranking members, et cetera. And then it moved to a point where, well, if you want to shape public policy, you actually have to shape public opinion because those decision makers are looking at their constituents. They want to make sure that they get reelected. So obviously the concentration of power that you've described kind of causes that to move back. But at the same time, there are still, organizations and groups that are very focused on shaping public opinion. So just would love kind of to hear your thoughts on what you're seeing there before we go to the other side of things. And also when we look at that, the ways that people shape public opinion, continues to change. So maybe you could say something a little bit about that before we move on.
Yeah. So there's two ways of getting to Trump. One is to use the inside game and hire one of the handful of lobbyists who he's friends with. A top name always mentions a guy named Brian Ballard. Brian Ballard was a fundraiser for Donald Trump in 2016, 2015, when Trump was running for president. So it was in with him very, very early on when most Republicans were not supporting Trump. So he's one of the few people who knew Trump when Trump was elected. And when companies and industries and countries wanted to have influence over Trump, Brian Ballard was one of the few people who knew Trump. So Brian Ballard signed up, scores of companies and has been incredibly successful. The other way of getting to Trump, though, is that, he also cares about his public opinion and his approval rating. He's obviously not running for re-election, but he wants to be popular. Everyone wants to be popular, and especially someone like Trump wants to be liked. So companies and industries know that if they can make Trump believe that would be more popular if he supported XYZ, then he's going to go in that direction. So there still is this huge fight over shaping public opinion in order to get Trump to support a policy or not. Now, what's harder is that back when Congress was functioning and effective, you had the Ways and Means Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee is the committee that writes the tax law for the country. And there's probably 55, 60 members of that committee, and they had 55 or 60 districts. So if you wanted to shape policy in the Ways and Means Committee, you'd find the 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 key people on an issue, and you could run public affairs campaigns in those 12 districts to try to get those 12 members. That's a lot easier than now with Trump, where you need to shape policy shape public opinion for the entire country to get to Trump.
As you kind of talk about shifting back or reverting back to a pre-Watergate model where power is concentrated, I'm reminded that you and I were at a private dinner together several months ago, and I won't say who it was, but a very well-known business leader said to a group of public affairs professionals, look, if I can sponsor the inauguration or a ballroom, why would I spend any money with your firms or your organizations on K Street? And so I'm wondering how that's impacting the world of lobbying and, how CEOs are bypassing K Street. And I guess what I'm wanting to know too, just from an industry standpoint, Brody, is, for the big decisions like, tariffs on a country or a specific industry, are folks going, right to the head honcho? But then when it comes to, a provision that's written on the 500th page of a bill that might, impact a couple $1 million of tax liability, is that where the lobbying firms are focused? Because obviously there's just so many things going on. Not every single issue can, be brought up directly with presidents in the United States.
So there's 10 different ways to go with that question. So I'll do my best. One, starting at the end, Congress isn't passing laws. So the provision tucked on page 500 of some bill doesn't exist anymore, with the exception of the tax bill that passed last year. So there's really not, Congress isn't doing those things. And so, yes, you can make an argument, well, why do I need these lobbyists? Why am I paying them millions of dollars? And, another thing to think about, though, is that even though Trump dominates our lives right now, like every single thing we see is about something that Trump did today, every second of every day. He is kind of a short-term guy. I mean, he's sort of a blip in our history, and he will be gone in now 2.5, 3 years. And his power, after the midterms might decline, and certainly once we get into 2028, people are going to be focusing on, is it Vance or is it Rubio, or who's the next person? So his power will decline, and therefore, Congress will probably become more effective or more impactful, down the road. So maybe it's not the time to completely ignore Congress. But to your point about this this sort of new avenue of influence, which is donating to the library and donating to the White House renovation and donating to, buying the crypto, all these things sort of didn't really exist before. So it's all new. Going to Mar-a-Lago, becoming a Mar-a-Lago member, donate, all this stuff, which seems very transactional. That stuff didn't really happen before, or certainly is now happening on a 10x or 100x. So yeah, if money is no option, would you make a big donation to the library and join Mar-a-Lago? I would think yes. However, there's yes and a caveat. The yes is Trump doesn't like talking to lobbyists. He likes talking to CEOs. He likes talking to the important people. So the CEO should do things in order to get in front of Trump and have a conversation, or call Trump. I mean, Trump likes to just talk to people about what's going on out there. So that can be very effective. However, the caveat is all these companies that have been giving money to all these groups, the inauguration, the library, blah, blah, I don't know if they're really getting anything. They certainly could. It appears, it looks bad. And I have a little bit of a counterintuitive view here. I haven't really seen people get things. The tech industry is still under fire from antitrust officials. Every company in the country does not want tariffs. And then we've got tariffs. Every company in the country wants more immigrants, more because, immigrants work on farms and they work in factories and they would take these jobs that Americans don't want. And Trump is opposed to that. So a lot of the things these companies want, they're not getting. Now, I'm sure we can find some one-offs there, but overall, I think the idea is that you can write these checks to get in front of the president and call the president and get in front of everybody, but you may not get what you want.
Yeah, great point. So that's what that's the avenue they're going down, but it may not actually get them the results that they're looking for. So maybe they won't have the influence that they want.
Maybe part of lobbying and influence, though, is just being able to have the conversation.
Right.
Like the money gets you the conversation, and the PAC donation gets you to the member of Congress. It doesn't necessarily mean that you win the argument,
Sure.
but you need that access to have the argument, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose.
So another thing I want to talk about when it comes to the transformation of influence is the fall of gatekeepers. I mean, you don't speak about it directly in the book, I don't think, but obviously something that really changed over that period of time was a few consolidated media companies that were very tightly controlled gatekeepers of what stories Americans learned about and what was covered related to public policy. And now those traditional media guardrails have really collapsed, and we can certainly see how people are getting their news through technology platforms like Instagram and TikTok and X much more than they are from the legacy media. How much would you say the collapse of that system and the fall of the gatekeepers has contributed to this shift in influence where inside influence has become much more powerful than the outside influence?
That's another great question. Just step back for a second. Our book came out, let's say 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, and the world looked one way, and that's what we wrote about. And just since then, in the last year and a half, everything's turning upside down. The Republican Party is turning upside down. I just described how the way the government power is held is turning upside down. The Democratic Party is changing. And then we've got the media. The media is completely changing in the last, 2 to 5 to 10 years. The Washington Post is sort of falling apart. Other great media institutions are before. It used to be that we got our news from CBS or when we were kids, CBS, ABC, or NBC. And now, then cable came along, and now it's just constant. Now people are getting the news from us right now, So I would think a lot of that would be good, right? That there's more democratization of the news, that people can get news wherever they want. And you don't have to go to the right journalism school and, go to this, take this right class and, work your way up through an internship to work at the Wall Street Journal, that you can just go start your own podcast. I mean, anyone can start a news podcast today. So I would think that would be a good thing. The problem is that it sort of created avenues for the far right and far left to create sort of news channels and ways of getting to lawmakers, where lawmakers and public officials and, Americans tend to just watch the news that they want to watch. And, you can turn on Fox News and hear one set of, or Fox News or, Breitbart or any of the, right-wing publications, and get one set of news. Then you go to the left, you get a completely different set of news, and they're not overlapping at all. And at the end of the day, the media plays an incredibly important role in our democracy. And the role is, here are the facts. This is what happened today. You, the American people, can decide whether you like that or whether you don't like that or how to fix it. And we're not right now agreeing on a set of facts. We're putting out two different skewed sets of facts. And that's incredibly distorting to the public. And unfortunately, I think undermines democracy. And, I don't know a way of fixing that, because we have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment says that anyone has the right to free speech. The other strange thing is, I grew up in an era where, we were told not to believe everything you see on TV. And I sort of thought, like, well, once the internet comes along, well, that's times 10. You're very skeptical on the internet. But for some strange reason, people believe everything they see on the internet. And people aren't skeptical. So I sort of thought that, well, these various, blogs and publications will come along and they'll be wrong a lot. And people will say, okay, I'm not going to trust these sources. I'm going to go back to the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, CNN, Fox, whatever you believe in. But it doesn't seem like that's the case. So it's a really troubling phenomenon. How does it affect influence? The way it affects influence is this. It used to be that when there was the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and those traditional gatekeepers, companies and industries try to get their message to members of Congress by pitching stories or trying to plant stories or, get a quote in a story. And they spend all this time trying to shape mainstream media stories. And now people know Republicans are in charge of the White House, they're in charge of the House, they're in charge of the Senate. Every Republican reads Breitbart. So let's skip the Wall Street Journal and skip the New York Times. Let's just go to Breitbart, get a story in there, which is much easier to do, and it runs. And your whole audience reads it. And if you want to get to Elizabeth Warren and Lena Khan on the left, you just use the left publications. And I think that's sort of troubling because each side is getting only their own set of news. And that some of those publications don't have the same credibility or fact checking that a Wall Street Journal would.
This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. And you used to hear, I don't know if this is still the case, some savvy PR people that you go to that small hometown newspaper in the district that might be really easy to get into and get something placed there, get an opinion piece there, get a letter there because the member really wants to keep tabs on what's happening back home. Those publications are vanishing at an astonishing rate. And then we're seeing the rise of independent journalists. One of our upcoming chief influencers is a guy who has really become so well known, Aaron Parnas. He describes himself as an independent journalist. He's amassed millions of followers. I mean, he's second to only Fox News, I think, on Substack right now. And he's been called the new Walter Cronkite. And so I would love to dive in a little bit more to how you think this shift in the media landscape is influencing public policy. And, what sort of strikes me is that a member of Congress probably realizes that, many of them go do interviews with Aaron Parnas. So they obviously realize that their constituents are paying attention to him. I don't know if they're paying attention to him though, right? If you want to get a message directly to those decision makers, I don't know if that's the avenue to do it, but they know that he has millions and millions of followers. And so they pay attention to him. So just would love your take on that shift as well.
Yeah. So the issue here, that's troubling is that the traditional media firms, which had flaws and people considered them, gatekeepers, which is bad, and they had too much, influence, but they do, and I'm a mainstream, lifelong mainstream media member. They do try to tell the truth. They try to be down the middle. Everyone has their own bias, but I can tell you all the reporters I've ever dealt with have tried to tell the story down the middle, even if they're a Democrat or a Republican. And when you're working for a big publication and they are the brand and you get paid each week or month by the publication. In this new world, you get paid by the number of subscribers you have. And if you try to tell the story down the middle, well, sometimes that's boring. And what people have found is that if you spend all day praising Donald Trump or spend all day bashing Donald Trump, you get a lot of followers. And a lot of followers means a lot of dollars. So the incentives are to do and say crazy things, to bash Trump or bash Elizabeth Warren all day long, and that skews the news because you're not trying to tell the news down the middle. You're trying to promote a story, a vision that is followed by either the far right or the far left. So that's part of the financial incentives that sort of distort the media. And if you're doing that, then there's fewer people are trying to tell the story down the middle.
I've been asking you a lot of questions from the perspective of Brody, the investigative journalist, the author, looking at the business of influence. I think this might be a good time to pivot because we're talking about content creators to sort of put another hat on that you wear, which is you are a content creator. Beyond just being a reporter and an author, which, are sort of traditional things that folks have done for a long time. You're building your own media platforms, Substack, podcasts. So can you sort of tell us how has your understanding of influence evolved as you have become a creator yourself? And what are you learning about influence that you're trying to apply to your work as a creator or that you're learning from your work as a creator that you're now kind of viewing the world of influence from a different perspective.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. So it's an area that I'm still learning. I spent, I think, let's say 30 years in the mainstream media and let's say a year in sort of the independent space. I'm still trying to figure it out. I'd never been on never run a podcast until, last summer. So I'm still figuring all these things out. But to your point, what I found that's most interesting is that with the decline of the mainstream media and the fact that companies feel like they can't get their messages out because they used to be able to pitch the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or other publications to get a story that, would communicate their message to Congress or to the public. There are fewer avenues for companies and industries to get their messages out. And they're looking for podcasts and what they call owned content or controlled content, other places where they can get their messages out. So I sort of noticed that as I started my podcast, which are sort of, news or, interviewing important people about important things, that meanwhile, there's like companies off to the left who are like, hey, we'd love to get on your podcast and like talk about our issues for a long time. And so that's interesting that companies are trying to figure out how do we create our own content. It goes back to something I said earlier. I thought that people would care about the credibility of the platform, right? You trust the Wall Street Journal, so you read it. Companies have realized that people don't really care about the platform. So if Ford has a message to get out there on auto safety regulations, they can just put it out there themselves and people will read it and believe it. And so I think more and more companies are getting into the content creation business themselves, which is sort of fascinating.
And I think you're right that if you reach people, they maybe don't care where it comes from. The challenge is getting that reach because a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of YouTube channels out there, and we've seen, folks that try to stand something up and they hope that if you build it, they will come, and they realize that may be a little bit trickier than you think. So I don't know. What are you seeing about obtaining that reach when folks are trying to get their message out?
I go in two different directions. In the normal world where people are trying to get paid or make money from podcasts by getting advertisers, yes, you need hundreds of thousands of people or 50,000 people to, have your podcast on YouTube generate revenue. But for companies, they're really trying to get to 535 people. They don't, if they're trying to influence policy, they don't necessarily have to have those huge numbers. So, there's the big national audience that really matters for advertising, but there's also a really small set of eyeballs in DC who are very lucrative. The folks who work on Capitol Hill, the folks who work in the Trump administration. So there's sort of like broadcast and narrowcast. And there are some publications, I think Punchbowl is a great one. Punchbowl was started by friends of mine 5 years ago now, I think. Writing about Capitol Hill, only Congress, really focusing on the leadership. It's a very, very small audience, but it's incredibly valuable because those are the people who are moving and shaping laws and policy on Capitol Hill, and everyone there is reading Punchbowl. So, I think it's sort of two different ways to go, and I think some are successful going broad, and some are successful going narrow.
Yeah, you mentioned Punchbowl, so I have to say, Anna Palmer, who's the co-founder of Punchbowl, was featured as a chief influencer.
Oh, cool.
We have a great interview with her. And one of the things that really jumped out at me from her interview was she said, look, we're creating a new media company. We don't want to take yesterday's playbook and try to build a, quote, audience. Instead, we want to build a community. And so they really focused on things that help folks feel like they're part of a community. The style of their early morning podcast is such that people wake up every morning and say, hey, I'm hearing Anna and her co-host. They kind of feel like they're part of my life because they listen to that every single morning. It's very conversational. They have events that they do at their townhouse where they bring people together. And that's an approach that I've seen. I mean, I think it reflects something that you're saying is rather than try to reach everybody, which was yesterday's broadcast, mass media, outside influence approach, figure out a much smaller audience, in some cases an audience of one, in some cases an audience of 535, et cetera, and try to really do a good job connecting with that niche audience. And that makes me think, your advice perhaps to somebody who's, a CEO, somebody who's leading a Washington office might be that, hey, if you are creating content and getting it out there and you're not reaching millions of people, but you're reaching a small number of the right people, then you're on the right track, because that's what influence looks like today. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that kind of an assessment correct there?
I mean, if Donald Trump or Susie Wiles starts following your podcast, you're winning, and that's just one or two people. I mean, obviously those are the most important people, but you're absolutely right. It's about finding the right audience and the eyeballs, and there's not that many eyeballs in DC. I mean, DC is kind of more like a town than a city, but it's incredibly powerful and influential people. So, and in the case of Anna Palmer, a friend, and Punchbowl, they're not even trying to get all of DC. They're not even trying to get anyone outside the Beltway. They're not even trying to get people down Pennsylvania Avenue. They're just focusing on Capitol Hill, which is an even small, a niche within a niche within a niche, but it's the most important eyeballs outside of the White House.
Yeah, and it's an interesting media strategy as we look at some of the other newer media companies out there that, have popped up in the last decade or two. They are taking like a different approach where they're kind of going broader, and they're, going more international, or they're getting in local markets. And so that punch bowl approach, you know, is a different one, but obviously it seems to be really working well. I want to talk about something else that jumped out at me from your book, and then sort of tie it into contemporary times. Since even though it only was published 2 years ago, it seems like the world's changed so much. In terms of outside influence, you look at some tech companies trying to mobilize their users. So an example in your book is Google's blackout around the net neutrality debate. And more recently, TikTok tried a similar approach a couple years ago, and it seemed to have some backlash when users were contacting members of Congress. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit. Why do you think the first one succeeded, the second one failed, at least in the short term? Obviously, we've had TikTok developments since then.
So I think one of the things we're talking about in our book is sort of the move from the inside game to the outside game. The inside game being the relationship lobbying that we talked about, and the outside game really being the importance of American people and the public. And so we have a couple of examples along the way of these huge outside influence campaigns that worked. The first one being the defeat of Bill Clinton's healthcare legislation way back in 1993, and then we talk about Google's fight against bills that would have sort of curbed the growth of social media and websites and the internet. And it's back in 2011, 2012, big, powerful, entrenched companies like News Corp and Rupert Murdoch, and the movie industry and the publishing industry, and big sort of copyright holders saw that the rise of the internet would sort of undermine or could threaten and disrupt their industries. It turned out they were completely right, of course. And so they created this set of bills that would curb the growth of the internet. And Google and some of the bigger tech companies back then didn't have the influence that they have now. They didn't have the money to pay for lobbyists. They didn't have much money for PAC contributions. But they knew they were reaching millions of Americans who were going online every day. So in January 2012, they sponsored this Shut Down the Internet Day, which meant that Google and thousands of other websites put a little banner on their websites that said, Congress is trying to shut down the internet. Don't let them pass this bill. Call your member of Congress and tell them not to shut down the internet. And that day, millions, maybe tens of millions of Americans called Capitol Hill and told them to get rid of these bills. And the bills were like widely expected to become law. They had the support of 99 out of 100 senators at one point. Next day, they were killed. So this was sort of seen as an epic moment in grassroots advocacy. So cut to TikTok a couple of years ago. TikTok tried the same strategy, and it failed. And really unclear why it failed. I thought that it would have been successful, and it might be that members of Congress are savvier now than they were back then, or maybe that's that it was TikTok and people knew that TikTok was behind it, very specific to one company rather than the internet in general. But it seemed like they used the right tactic, but then failed, and it's really unclear why it did.
Yeah, I mean, obviously some different factors with TikTok, because there were concerns there with international foreign, interference, and that wasn't as much the case with the Google, of course, and others. But maybe something I hadn't thought about that you just sort of mentioned is maybe the coalition of companies was more powerful because it sort of, the responsibility was sort of diffused and it got more people involved than having one company focus on it.
Maybe that's what it was. It was shutting down the entire internet as opposed to removing one company from the internet.
Yeah. And what I kind of observed in the media around that time was that when, some of the concerns around TikTok was that it, might be too powerful and that, there could be foreign interference, and that by activating so many people for a platform that had really kind of stayed away from politics, it reinforced the idea with some and said, aha, see, you have this power that could be used negatively. So, activating people sort of
No.
actually reinforced the concerns that some folks had. But you talk about, like, with the blackout, the internet blackout, you're calling your member of Congress. Do you think in this world where the audience has shrunk, does it make a difference if people call their member of Congress, Brody, or write their member of Congress?
I think that it does. I really do believe that members of Congress are most impacted, most influenced by their hometown constituents. We hear the word authentic a lot recently, authentic messages. And I think that, in this age of the internet, social media, targeted ads, and now I think that members in Congress and staff are so inundated with messages that they don't trust. Like, who are these? Who are sponsoring this? Where is this stuff coming from? That if you're a home state constituent or a business owner or an employee and you talk to your member of Congress in DC or at home, that's an authentic message that I think resonates with them. And at least it's someone who they believe because it's a human being. And members of Congress exist to get reelected. And if you're a constituent, talk to your member of Congress about something you care about, they will listen to you. And I think that at the end of the day is more powerful than the wealthiest lobbyist coming in and pitching you on some bill.
Yeah. Well, and that authenticity in the age of AI is such an important point because we remember it was around net neutrality that there was a big case where, bots had been used to send messages under, names of people who, weren't, they didn't actually send those notes themselves. And that's even before AI. And now, obviously, we can use, AI to really supercharge that and knowing that it's a real person and a real story. I think that's a different episode that we're going to have to have you back for because I think we could talk about that so much. I want to close. This is, again, Wolves of K Street, excellent book. I keep recommending it to everyone. So I hope that our listeners will check it out if they haven't already. But I'm always interested in this topic of what it takes to become a chief influencer and how influence has evolved, to ask our guests when we close. How do you define influence today? And what do you think most leaders misunderstand about it?
That's a hard question. I think influence today is unfortunately, it's the ability to get to Donald Trump, whether that's through a relationship or through a public affairs campaign. I say unfortunately because, our government was designed to have three co-equal and competing branches of government. And right now, because of the way Donald Trump acts through executive order, it's this audience of one. So influence and power today are the ability to get to Donald Trump, period.
And obviously, we've been talking about influence in Washington specifically. I think the way I would sort of extrapolate that a little bit just to, even a broader view is the key lesson that I think you have shared in this discussion, also in your amazing book, The Wolves of K Street, is that influence is really about knowing who you need to influence. You have to start with who that audience is. And the shift of influence that you describe in your book, from inside influence to outside influence, happened as power shifted in Washington to, become was more concentrated, became less concentrated, and it's become more concentrated again recently. And now an audience of one for so many things is important. And so making sure we understand who we're trying to influence and then the effective ways to get that message out in a vast media landscape that, continues to fracture and continues to change. And I think it's pretty cool to see how not only have you been reporting on this, not only have you written about this, but you are continuing to expand your influence. So many people are talking about your writing and your book, and I'm seeing you pop up all over the place, and you're, developing your own media channels as an independent to get your message out to your podcast, et cetera. So for anybody who wants to learn more about you, Brody, obviously they can check out the Wolves of K Street, but where else do you want them to go to follow you and to learn more?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is where I put out most of my stuff. Also, I have a couple of different platforms that you could subscribe to through my website, which is the Wolves of K Street podcast.com. And sign up there for my newsletter, and I can get you hooked up in my LinkedIn also.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver. We help clients transform complexity into clarity with people-centered strategies. Whether you're looking to elevate the influence of your brand or of your leaders, check out socialdriver.com to learn more. For show notes or to nominate a guest, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn.